Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Boyd, and I am delighted to welcome you all to tonight's conversation celebrating the book launch of Steve Major's major new book, High Yella, a Modern Family Memoir. I am the director of the Low-residency MFA Program in Narrative Nonfiction at the University of Georgia. And I'm also an editor at large at UGA Press. And UGA Press is honored to have published Steve's new book, which you're going to hear a lot about this evening, and which we're very much looking forward to talking with you about and hearing your comments and questions. The conversation today will be moderated by Anjali Enjeti. Anjali is an author, a teacher, an activist, and the author of two new books. One is a novel called The Parted Earth, which was published by our friends over at Hub City Press. And her book of essays was published by UGA Press, again by the Crux literary series, which is the series that published Steve's book. Southbound is essays on identity, inheritance, and social change. It's a book that the Washington Post praised as being a nuanced and much needed journey into exploring what it means to be American. So Anjali will lead a very engaging discussion, I'm sure, with Steve Majors, who, again, we are proud to welcome to the UGA Press fold and proud to have this conversation with tonight. Steve is a former television news journalist who worked for media organizations such as NBC News and most recently for mission-driven national nonprofit organizations. His essays on race, culture, and identity have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other outlets. He currently serves as Vice President of Marketing for Teach for America. And I know Anjali is going to say more about his book, High Yella, but you should know that Kirkus Reviews called it a brave reckoning with multiple questions of identity, class, family, and race. So please join me now in welcoming Steve Majors, who's going to give us a little taste from his book, and then we'll dive into the conversation. Steve, welcome.
Valerie, thank you so much. And before I begin, I have to just thank UGA Press and your wonderful staff for the great opportunity to bring High Yella to the world. And a thanks to the writing community out there who've been an incredible amount of support. Anjali, you've been among them, and I know we'll be in conversation shortly. But this would not have been possible with so many people supporting me along the way, some of whom are joining us tonight. I think what might be helpful before I read from the book is to give a little bit of context about sort of my family story without giving giving away too much about the book and sort of the framework for it. So I am the youngest of 5 children. My mother was a single mother raising 5 children. My 5 older siblings all had the same father. So my mom and their dad were Black. I was the product of a brief relationship that my mother had after she was separated from her husband, and that relationship was with a white man. And if you have seen the cover of the book, you will certainly be able to tell that I looked drastically different from my family of birth. And what was more complex was that we lived in a very small rural community, a very rural, predominantly white community. And so we were among the very few Black families in that community. Our extended family, again, we lived in a very sort of isolated area where it was really the extended family that we had around us. And so that was my family of birth. And so there was a real reckoning for me on identity as I was a young child and certainly into adulthood. Fast forward to my family of choice, the family that I choose, that is my husband, Todd, who is white and Jewish, and our 2 adopted daughters, who are Black. And the book came out of how I tried to sort of reconcile what was happening what happened in my past and what was happening in my present. And so it's sort of an intertwining tale of two families grappling with those issues of race and identity, who we were as a family and who we are to the world. And so with that in mind, that's where High Yella came from. I'll briefly also say that the book began probably about, the first draft was about 4 years ago this month, in which I took sort of a short sabbatical from my position and began to pull together some essays that I had written, some themes from some essays that I'd written about my family, about my family of birth and my family of choice. And in that way, that was sort of the spine or the arc of the book, and that's how it came together. So with that, I'd like to read a small portion of the book. This comes from chapter 6 that was titled Light, Bright, and Almost White. And I'll begin in the middle of the chapter. The kids on the school playground weren't the only ones who questioned where my light, bright complexion came from. So did my first friend in life, my cousin Kathleen. Only 6 months in age and a few yards of crabgrass separated me and my Aunt Bonnie's daughter. So from the time we were toddlers, we were inseparable. The grown-ups said, where you saw one of us, you saw the other, and they took to calling us Salt and Pepper. They thought it was funny, and so did Kathleen and I, until it occurred to both of us one day that our nickname didn't just mean we naturally went together. We'd already started comparing ourselves, our height, our speed, what made me a boy and her a girl. But now we began to place our hands and arms side by side to see the differences that everyone else saw. Maybe you just need a suntan, Kathleen offered as she poked at my freckled skin. Yeah, maybe, I said, but neither of us was really convinced. Although I was looking for an explanation, there was another part of me that was afraid someone would tell me that I might not really belong. My raucous and raw-talking family confused and scared me, but they were all I had in the world. And as a little boy, I still needed assurance that I had a place among them. I learned the hard way not to ask them questions. So I kept my doubts to myself. The exception was Kathleen. Together, we'd come to understand that we lived in an extended family where bad things happened and where everyone kept those things secret. It was comforting to know Kathleen and I at least had each other to share our own secrets and sorrows. Our shared experiences of growing up in those circumstances also meant we understood each other all too well. While it was true that only Kathleen knew exactly what to say to make me laugh until my belly hurt, it was also a fact that her words could just as easily bring me to bitter tears. That happened one day while we were playing our favorite game of pretend outside. We like to role play rich people, the families who ate out at McDonald's or shopped at JCPenney's. I can't remember why we argued, but Kathleen demanded she'd have the last word. Shut up, she said, putting her hands on her hips like the grown folks did. Although we were the same age, Kathleen stood about an inch taller than me. I was determined not to be bossed around. Make me, I said. Kathleen shoved me hard until I fell on the ground. When she saw me trying to stand up, she shoved me back down and spit on me. How do you like that, huh? Now go on and cry with your dumb self. You think I care? Run home your mother with your stupid, funky white ass. Her words hurt more than any physical blows could, because in that moment, Kathleen had uttered a secret curse. She didn't say I just needed more sun or claim I was black like my siblings. She didn't take delight in being a part of Salt and Pepper. Instead, she called me something that no one else had, a word she knew would hurt and confuse me. She called me white. And that meant all the terrible things I thought about myself, things nobody would ever admit, were probably true. I ran home with hot tears and snot running down my face. I was too ashamed to repeat Kathleen's words to Ma. So I just told her we fought. Ma told me that things would be okay. And a few days later, things would be better for a time. Kathleen and I would be back to giggling and acting the fool. But after that, I figured that Kathleen was like everyone else. holding back the shameful truth about who and what I was. Afterward, I learned to always hold something back, to not let her or anyone else in my family too close. Just like many of the adults in our family, Kathleen wasn't someone I could completely trust or turn to. Because in a heartbeat, she might turn her fists and her words on me. Family or no family, I was beginning to realize I always had to look out for myself. It was the only way to protect my skin, let alone my heart.
Absolutely gorgeous, Steve. I first want to thank you for writing such a beautiful memoir. I want to thank you for allowing me to be in conversation with you tonight. It is such an incredible honor for me. I could not put this book down. I just wanted to show the cover for anyone who hasn't seen it. This is Steve's family. And I'm so excited to talk with you about this book. I have so many questions. Steve asked me earlier today what part he should read from the book, and it presented an enormous dilemma for me because every word in this book is as beautiful as the passage that he just read. So you definitely want to check this out. I would like to invite the audience at this time to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A below. And I'm going to ask the questions as they appear and just weave them into our conversation. I don't want to make anyone have to wait until the end. So please, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. So Steve, I've got a question to start out with though. You mentioned starting on this book 4 years ago. It's a deeply provocative and personal telling of both your childhood family and your current family that you are raising. As you were putting together this book, was it challenging for you to decide what to include and what to exclude, what to reveal to the general public, and what maybe should be held close to your heart? And how did you make those types of decisions as a writer?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, people often ask, as a writer, I primarily I write for myself, right? And you hope that there are windows opened up that might provide insights for other people. So I began this writing for myself. And I've told folks that it came out of, I began sort of personal journaling for myself, sort of reconciling and really sort of grappling with some really tough issues. And then that became sort of public blogging. And in that way, I began to share some details about the parts of my family. I would tell you is in the first draft, I sort of let it all hang out, to be honest with you. And for me, this book, I felt it had to be honest and authentic. And I came to understand that that also meant that it would be very raw and revealing in part. And ultimately, there are a number of folks in the book who have passed on. And that may have made some choices easier. There are a few folks in the family, in my birth family, that are still alive. Aunt Bonnie is one of them. And if you've read the book, there were some tough things that I had to write about my experience of her growing up. So what I would tell you is that ultimately my biggest consideration was protecting my children. So their names are changed in the book. And as you know, this is not an autobiography. It is not a history book. So not every sort of anecdote or story about our family is reflected in this memoir, but the ones that I feel were most important. Having said that, my own husband has said, well, you really sort of put us all out there now. But ultimately, I think this is a story of hope and a story of family redemption, a story of family reunification. And so even in those tough parts where I probably went right to the edge and revealed quite a bit, I feel completely comfortable today with where I landed. And so I know that there are people out there who know me and some who don't know me who are going to feel like, wow, that was quite a lot. But ultimately, those who know my heart and those who know our family, I think understand that we've always lived sort of authentic lives. And so that choice really came down to, was there anything that I felt would be hurtful or harmful to my children? And if there were parts in there that I felt would be uncomfortable for them, I did leave some of those things out.
And, you know, it's important to point out, I think, that while there are parts of the book where you are quite critical of some of your family members who are still living today, you also really turned a critical eye on yourself as an adult, as yourself as a parent to two young daughters. I'd like to know, Steve, can you talk a little bit about how your identity and the kind of family you grew up in may have prepared you to be a parent to two Black daughters, who are not only adopted, but who are being raised in a Jewish family, your husband's religion. There's a lot of sort of multiple identities and dynamics in your family. How did you growing up in your kind of family prepare you to become the parent that you needed to be for your daughters?
Yeah. I think very early on when we started on our journey of adoption, I think my husband and I agreed that because there are families out there who feel that in this case that, you know, that they the children that they adopt, they would prefer kids who looked more like them. That was never a consideration for us at the very beginning. And in fact, I think in my head, I said to myself, well, I grew up in a Black family, so I'd be fully prepared to raise Black children. That was true in some respects and untrue in other respects. You know, how I grew up, I think the lessons that I learned about parenting, there were some very positive lessons about parenting and some that were probably not helpful. Those who, you know, have cracked open the book, there were some elements of abuse and addiction and trauma in our family, in the family that I grew up in. And I think that I had hoped that I had sort of squelched those things and that was not true of me. And that I would be bringing all the sort of great parenting things, you know, I felt very loved as a child. I may have felt isolated and confused at times, but I felt loved. And I felt those positive things that I had gotten from my family that I'd be able to pass on. What I did not realize is that, you know, trauma is passed on as well. And it's not just a matter of genetics. There's a line in the book about like that trauma is often passed on, much like shared stories and family history and heirlooms. Those things are passed on. And I think when I got to a point in my life and my parenting, when I realized that I was in danger of passing those things on to my kids, that was a moment of reflection. And in terms of sort of this multiple identities, you know, my family treated me like I was no different than anyone else. In fact, I would say that in times it was awkward. You know, they were like, "You're Black." I'm like, "Okay, I understood that." But when I went out into the world, I'm like, the world does not see me as Black and may not ever. And so that caused some sort of confusion in me. I think that has been a positive benefit, though, this idea of, you know, as I tell my kids, like, we are family. We may look different. We may not be bound by blood, but we are family. And I hope and think that they believe that.
We've got our first question, Steve. And so I just want to go into that. This is from Kimara. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. What are your feelings about your family now? And if they've read your memoir, do they have feelings about the book?
Yeah. So, you know, the family that I grew up in has read the book. As I've said, like, you know, out of the, you know, 5 people on the cover, only 2 of us remain, myself and my oldest brother. A quick sort of sad story, my sister read some of the earlier drafts of this book and died unexpectedly a couple of years ago. And so it pains me that she's not here to sort of read this book now. But by and large, there were a couple of people in my family that I was very worried about. And I said to them, and yes, I had changed some names, but I said to them, I said, please read the book in its entirety. I'd like to believe that everyone, including myself, is really portrayed even-handedly. There's good and bad in all of us. And the same amount of things that I may have said about myself that may have been negative, I tried to balance that with the positive. And I did the same for those family members who I felt like may have had some issues with what I wrote. And my aunt, God bless her, she read the book and she called me about a couple of weeks after its release, and she said, it was a tough read. There were some things in there that were very tough for me to read and to hear. She said, but what helped me through it is I understood that you were writing this through the eyes of a child. This was your experience of me as a child, and I can buy that. And I tried to balance that. My experience of her as an adult is much different. We have a positive relationship now. That doesn't mean those things in the past didn't happen, or my remembrance of those happened, and those negative experiences. But I would say that by and large, they've all been supportive. And then my husband as well, he's read the book many times. My kids have read portions of the book. They have been part of the process of me they've watched me write the book. They know all the stories that I've written in the book. I've told them. And so they've been very supportive as well.
Steve, how old are your daughters now, if you don't mind me asking?
16 and 17, and all that comes with that.
Yes, I hear that. I've got kids that age too. So let me ask you this. Obviously, we have been in quite the political and cultural moment over the past 5 years or so. And things like rights that we've taken for granted, relatively new rights, are being stomped on, and we're under a threat of losing them. Can you talk a little bit about how a queer, mixed race, mixed faith family has been perceived over the years, over the 16, 17 years? I know you were together longer than that with Todd. But how has that changed for you all, and how do you have these conversations with children about it?
Yeah, it's changed sometimes based on geography, to be honest, and sometimes based on the ages of the kids. When they were very little, they were both adopted at birth, and we lived in a very progressive community in the Northeast. Where there were other gay families around us, other families that were interracial, or other families that were interfaith. And we felt welcome by and large. But there have been other places that we've lived throughout the country where that experience has varied. So we've lived in the Deep South, we've lived in New Orleans, and then we've lived here in the Mid-Atlantic in the DC area. And even in areas where you would think, well, gee, that must be more welcoming. It may be a more diverse community, or this may be a more progressive community. The experiences have changed, and we've been received in different ways. People, like some of the folks out there may recently have read a story I read about a mother of a mixed race child who looked, and the child was much a darker complexion than mom. And the mom was getting on a plane and was accused of, trafficking her own child. Similar experiences have happened with us, where we have been stopped by, we have been approached by the police, or we've been policed by other people who have questioned our right, or just the idea that we were the parents of these kids. Perhaps this is one of the positive things that, my mother gave me. So I mentioned that, we grew up in a very rural white community, and, walking into a store or walking down the street it was obvious that I looked drastically different than my mother. But she held her head high. She had no shame. I was her son. She didn't feel a need to explain me to anyone. We were just family. And that same mindset I hold with my own children today. I think there were times when I might have worried or wondered about invisible eyes looking at us, like, who are they? How do they all fit together? But for the most part, I have sort of, channeled the spirit of my mother. I don't have to explain my family to anyone and never will. And if anyone challenges us, I'm willing to sort of stand up and do whatever is necessary to protect them. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, Steve. And actually, it leads right into a related question in our Q&A from May. May asks, what was it like to grow up Black and gay? Did you experience homophobia within your birth family or the larger Black community?
Oh, absolutely. And that is not meant to, again, I'm only speaking from the experience of my family. I have spoken, again, in parts of the Black community, being gay can be complex and difficult and challenging. But so I'm only speaking about my experience. They were very homophobic, very homophobic. And I probably was myself. The words that they used, the way that they treated people who were perceived to be gay or lesbian were outrageous. And I know for a fact that there were closeted people in my family. Only as an adult that I know that there were people who were closeted and gay or lesbian in my family. And I, as a child, so it took me a while to sort of reconcile like why those words felt strange and threatening to me. I can only imagine what that must have been for the adults in my family who were hiding themselves. To my family's credit, I came out to them. It wasn't relatively early, but when I did come out to them, they were nothing but welcoming and supportive of me, of my husband, of our family. They've been incredibly loving to us. And I think that's sort of, it gets at something else in the book, is that there's an arc to that story of my family, who they were as a child, for me as a child, and who they are now. You can work through trauma. You can transcend poverty. You can leave behind bad behaviors and antiquated attitudes. You can do that. And I've watched my family do that. And I'm so proud of who they are today. And, if nothing else, writing this book has brought them alive for me again. I miss my family terribly. I really do. I look at this like this is the only family photo I really have of them, and I miss them today. And writing this book about them, in spite of both the good and the bad, has brought them alive for me in a way that I haven't felt in a long time.
And you really do honor them. I mean, I can feel, even when you're being critical, I can feel the love that you have for your family members. I can feel the respect, and I can feel how this is really a narrative that ends up, it's honoring them. It's honoring them for their humanity, for the people that they become for you. And you touched on a little bit about courage in some sense, about the courage of being able to live how you want to be in the world, how you identify. One of the most interesting people in your family to me was your grandmother, who was a Black woman and had a long-term partner who was a white man at a time when it was not safe to do so, when there would be members of the Klan in the area and she would have to hide, low in the car when John was driving them around. How did that relationship, especially knowing that it happened at a time when it was very risky to have it, how did that sort of influence your ability to live your life and to have relationships with who you wanted to?
Yeah. What's interesting to me is only as an adult did I understand like what a risk that they had taken. When they passed within 5 or 6 years of one another, but they had been together, gosh, 45 years plus. And at a time when they first were together, they were, and again, we were in Western New York. They were together at a time in the late 40s where it was dangerous for them to even be seen together, let alone living, cohabitating with one another. And later in life, I would hear stories of how, yes, the Klan would regularly visit their house. The police would come to their house and shine a spotlight in their windows night after night after night in the hopes of catching them. But a point that I make in the book, that sort of that resilience and that steadiness that they maintained over 45 years changed the attitudes of the people who interacted with them. They became so known in that community that people knew them, and were able to kind of, I guess, look past any sort of feelings they had about interracial relationships. They were just Claudine and John. They were not that white man and that black woman who live in that house with kids. And so for me, I didn't have a father in my life. I did not know my birth father. I've never met him, don't know who he is. And the man who was the father of my siblings was out of my life relatively early, but had a very lasting and very traumatic effect on our lives. And the relationship that John had with my grandmother, that steadiness, and although I probably didn't know it at the time, this idea that it was okay to love who you loved, I'm sure somewhere along the way helped give me courage when I was ready to come out and I was ready to tell my family that I loved who I loved. An interesting fact, I mean, for as homophobic and yes, just racist. Well, I don't want to use that term racist. How very anti-white my family was. They are an interesting group of people. Now I like to describe this as sort of a Benetton ad. Like there are many mixed race marriages. There are people who are proudly out and gay and lesbian in my family and feel loved and supported. And I go back to that really important relationship that we watched and witnessed. It wasn't a perfect relationship by any means. And I have to wonder whether or not the model of that really was one of the reasons that my family came to sort of grow, evolve, mature, become more welcoming, understanding.
I love that. One of the things, Steve, that I thought about when I was writing this book is you could have written it in a completely chronological telling, right? You could have started from your earliest memories of childhood, and you do start from a relatively early memory of childhood, and you could have just proceeded straight chronologically, and it still would have been such a compelling read. But you didn't do that, and it's the construction of the book that I think is one of the most fascinating things about it. You go back and forth in time between childhood and adulthood, but there's an added intention there in that there is often a parallel between the scenes, so that the theme and sort of what you're writing in a scene that takes place in your childhood is often very connected to the theme that you're reflecting in a scene written in adulthood. You started out saying that this was, you started writing as essays 4 years ago. How did you arrive at this method to tell this story?
I will tell you, Anjali, I am not as practiced in the craft of writing, nonfiction or novels as you are. It was hard. It was so hard. But
I will disagree with it, because it certainly reads like it was a very practiced book. And I mean, perhaps we can credit that to your long career in broadcast journalism. I don't know, but yes, please go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it was very hard. But once I knew that that was the structure I wanted, I was adamant that that was the way that it had to be. And there were people along the process who came to me and said, "You're a new author, like, too chronological, or this may be a tough sort of thing for folks to follow, this structure." But I knew that wasn't right for me. I can tell you where I think the inspiration came from. It may have come from, I am a media watcher. I watch a lot of movies and a lot of television, and that construction is often popular in that medium. The flashback, cut to present, parallel themes, and you're like, oh, I get it. I hear what's happening. And it's easy to follow in certain mediums, right? Because there are cues that you can see. There are dates past 10 years ago, this year's, and that can work. But it was so painstakingly hard. I could not believe it. And I'm just so proud about the way that it works, and that people have read it go, I get it. I get what you were trying to do. Arriving at that for me was, I had stories, I had essays that I had written about, my childhood. I had essays that I had written about my present day family. And whether I was conscious of it or not, there were parallel themes that I could see. And I remember in the very first outline of that, there was a time where I did write. It was chronological, childhood to adulthood. And it felt like, it felt uneven, because there were parts of the childhood that were so heavy and so fraught with emotion. It was just too much to take in. I could imagine if I had written all the childhood scenes and put that in a book, people may have gotten, honestly, to chapter 3 or 4 and like, wow, this is just too much for my head and my heart. I can't take anymore. And I was very conscious of not wanting to write what I call trauma porn, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Here's my horrific childhood. And so it became a way to to provide an emotional break. It also was for me a way, there were essays and stories that I liked, both about present and past, and to be able to give them equal weight. And for me, this may only be the case in memoir writing, right? It was a way of making sense. I saw the parallels. I could see what was happening. I could see that, I could see sort of synchronicity between things that had happened in my childhood and that were happening in present day. And because I could see them, I wanted other people to see them too. And they were sort of very powerful insights in my life. And I thought, how can I convey this to folks so that they see how this plays out in families?
And for me, when I was reading Steve, it made me think, that this was clearly written this way because you had processed some of the trauma from your childhood and you had been able to get perspective on it. Anyway, it was a beautiful telling, and Hannah, who's in the chat, completely agrees with me. So this was a question I had, especially after in the book, when you reveal that you end up adopting one child and then a second child not too long afterwards. I want to know, if you had not had children, would you be as far along in processing, in the emotional and the psychological process of understanding your identity and understanding your community. Do you feel like your children and raising children helped you to do this?
I have never thought about that, but I have to imagine yes. Yes. I was parenting my children, adopting my children and parenting them forced me to confront some very real issues of my childhood and things that I had really never reckoned with in terms of my own identity. Kids have a way of, you know, raising you, or
Mhm.
kids have a way of, um, I believe that we continue to grow as adults all the time, learning and growing, and they have a way, I think, of really putting a mirror up to you and forcing you to see things that you may be blind to. And my own daughters absolutely did that. Um, Sometimes very, very explicitly
Yeah.
by asking me, you know, are you really black? Like, and not, but meaning that their experience of what it meant to be black based on their own identity and their interaction with peers was very different from what they were experiencing from me. They're like, "You really black?" I'm like, "Oh yeah." Um, and so that was something that I had to reconcile. Like, um, our kids, whether they were adopted or they were biological, forced me to confront, like, what does it mean to be gay? Like, my daughter sometimes, like, like, we joke, like, I'm like, I'm sorry, all the stereotypical things. I didn't get the fabulous decorating gene. I didn't, all of those things. So her idea or perception of like what it means to be gay, like that is sometimes present in a popular culture, is not who I am or who my husband is. And so, sometimes we joke that, like, we probably have more in common than, like, a traditional sort of, heterosexual couple. I mean, that's just who we are. And so my kids sometimes jokingly, like, why can't you really be gay? You'd be much more fabulous. Help me pick out a dress and do my makeup and understand this and that. And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not true. But I had to reckon with that. And religion as well. Yeah. So our kids were raised Jewish. I'm Christian. And there have been times on that journey where they have questioned, like, should we be Jewish? And, and so my husband and I have had to get to a point where, like, as long as you have some spirituality, we would love you to follow the faith in which you were raised, but we have to give you the freedom to find your own identity. And at the end of the day, that's really sort of a common sort of theme in the book, that people are going to place identities or place you into categories based on who you look or who you love, or how you worship. And only you can determine those things, right? So I don't let anyone tell me, who I am. And that's taken a long time for me to probably say, well, I'm a mixed race person, but culturally and because of my family background, I identify as Black. But I also know there are many people out in the world that will just automatically assume that I'm white. It took me a long time to be able to say that and understand the implications of that.
And, Stephen, as a reader, the impression I got too was that sometimes it was your daughters. Sometimes it felt like your daughters were actually asking these questions of you that you were sort of running away from a little bit. Like you had sort of been evading your whole life. And then it was your own children asking you questions about, on the nose, about religion, about race, about being a queer family, where you were, it almost felt like they helped you complete that circle. I mean, it was just a beautiful synchronicity for me. It was the child teaching the parent in some ways, which I loved, and what what I think especially preteens and teenagers tend to do, right? I mean, they are there to challenge you, and in this book we see how they learn how to sort of challenge your identity in a way that helps them understand their own as well. And that was just a really beautiful relationship to see play out in the book. We've got another question in the chat, and actually there are two, and I apologize for butchering names here, but there was a question for Jamina about how people are reacting to your book. And then a question for Aman, which was, what did you learn about memoir writing and writing more generally while you were working on this book?
Yeah. I'll start with the second question first. And in terms of memoir writing, that it was, again, I have never written sort of book length, and there was an art and a very exact science to it. I understood the art of writing. I've written my entire life, but the science of writing a memoir was very specific. And I read a lot of memoir, and I read a lot of how-to memoir, and I probably read Mary Karr's book, The Art of Memoir, 5 times and literally took notes. And so that was the tough part, the idea of the science of memoir, of how to construct the book, what to leave in, what to leave out, the arc, choosing an arc. I learned quite a bit about memoir. I don't know if I could teach it, but it was just eye-opening. It was just interesting to understand that as a very specific genre that had their own very specific rules for doing it. So I quite a bit. And in terms of people's reactions to the book, again, very supportive, and I'm gratified for that, because again, it can be a very tough read, right? Some of the stories and the anecdotes in there can be very tough for folks. I had a very dear friend of mine who called it like, wow, this is very confessional. Like, parts of it are. And people have been very gracious, because I know there are things, whether they have known me for a very long time or knew me at some part, have known me at different parts of my life, or are just getting to know me. It can be very revealing. And I placed myself in a very vulnerable spot in doing so. And people have been very gracious about that. No one yet has come up to me and like, wow, chapter 5, wow. Or can't believe you went there, or what are your kids saying? No one has said that, and I've been grateful for it. And it is very freeing for me to be in this place where, because I grew up in a family where we lived in shame. There were so many secrets. And I have come to a point in my life where I'm tired of the shame. I'm tired of the secrets. I want to live my life fully and authentically. And so this has been a very freeing process, and people have been gracious about allowing me to live into that and not feel embarrassed or shameful about anything that I disclosed. And I don't feel any shame.
Nor should you. And you the way you write the book, Steve, and the way you unspool this story, I mean, this is, despite the fact that not everyone has had the family that you've had, it speaks to universal issues concerning families. And I want to touch on one that you write about very, very honestly, which is periods of estrangement that you had with your family. I mean, this is something, it's very common. A lot of people go through this, going several years without speaking to a family member, and then, really struggling with deciding, whether it's worth getting in touch again, whether that's just going to sort of reignite memories of trauma, or whether you no longer have anything in common, or whether there's some kind of betrayal. But time and time again, you do find yourself reuniting with your family members. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like?
Yeah, I think that's such an appropriate question. Like, we're just a couple of weeks from Thanksgiving. There's so many families every year that go through that sort of discernment process. And what I would say is that it goes back to my kids. It really came out of the need for my kids, for them to understand that they were part of a larger family. I think that's especially important in a family that's formed through adoption. Todd's family was very tight knit. They had very close connections and still do have very close, tight connections with his side of the family. And for me, I had pushed my family away from me. They had no connection. And at some point, it became important for them to see that they had family who looked like them.
Mm.
That was important because otherwise, all of the family that they were close to were white or looked white, and they didn't have family who looked like them. And so that was a very conscious choice to figure out, how do I bring my family closer into them? And it was not sort of uniform. There were some members of my family that I was, my sister I was very close with, and she was with, very close, very connected to my daughters from the time they were born. But there were other parts of my family that were sort of, it was intermittent, in and out. I would say writing this book, ironically, in spite of all the secrets that I've spilled, has brought me closer to even members of my family who I have not talked to in a long time. They have felt a sort of reconnection, and so have I. And so that was just an unanticipated effect of it. I worried so much that this would cause further estrangement. And in fact, it's caused it's the opposite. We've actually become much closer together as a family, and they've reached out to me and offered support for the book. And I'm grateful for that. I had no idea that was going to be the effect of it. And that is just, it's gratifying for me.
I love that. And I'm not surprised, Steve, even though I've never met any of your family members, this book is written with such heart. It really is. This book is really a book about humanity and about how love evolves over time. And so that doesn't surprise me at all. We've got another question here from Sejal Shah, who you know. And before I ask it, I just want to let people know that we're approaching the top of the hour. So if you've got any other questions you'd like to ask, please put them in the Q&A so we can get to them before we wrap up. So Sejal's question is, what is your greatest hope for this book?
I've already achieved it. Honestly, I just, there's an acknowledgement in the back to my third grade teacher, who I promised, I was like, Ms. Horgan, one day I'm going to grow up and I'm going to write a book and I'm going to dedicate it to you. And that is off my bucket list. Like, Ms. Horgan is looking down for me, and I've written this book that I promised her in the third grade. My sister, who has passed, we were a family of storytellers. And I often say we told stories to make sense of the chaos around us, to help us cope with it, to help us sort of deal with it. We rewrote our own histories in the stories that we told and made some of us villains and others of us heroes. And that was a way for us to deal with very sort of conflicted feelings we had about each other. And my sister would often tell me, as we would laugh and tell stories to each other, somebody's got to write this down. Somebody's got to write this down. And as I went into a field where I was writing, that was the thing that she said to me. She said, Stevie, you got to write this book. No one else is going to write this book. You need to write this book. And I have done that. And that is the greatest joy for me that I have done. Again, and the third thing, like, I've already achieved it. No matter what happens from here on out, my family is alive. Mm-hmm. I keep coming back to that, and that sounds weird, but they are alive in the world because I wrote this book. And, it has been a number of years since my mother has passed on, and my brothers and my grandmother and so many of my families passed on, and they're alive again. And for that, because of this book, And so I've achieved what I set out to do. The fact that there are other folks who are interested in reading it and sharing it and talking about it, that's icing on the cake.
And your answer goes beautifully into another question from the Q&A, which is from Jennifer. Thank you for asking it, Jennifer. It is, what advice do you have for writers who want to write memoir, but might be afraid?
Yeah. Don't set out to say like, okay, let me start my draft, or let me begin in small increments. And I thought that was so helpful to me. It was writing micro stories. And I started off like, it began as journaling and then blogging, but writing short, sharp stories or memories, and really just perfecting those and enjoying how they move you and provide great insights into you, and write them for yourself first. Do not write for an imaginary audience or an intended audience. Write them for yourself. And that was something I learned on my own. Nobody told me to, but I could not have possibly sat down to write this memoir. I could not have said, here's the memoir. I see it from beginning to end, but the stories were what really drove it. The stories led to the structure. The stories revealed the structure to me. And once the structure was revealed, I could learn the art. I could learn the science of how to put it together.
Oh, I love that, Steve. I want to say once again to everybody as we wrap up, High Yella. Y'all, this is one of the best books I've read this year. It's going to be big, it's going to be important, and it's going to be something. And everybody, please go out and buy this book. It's a wonderful book. The holidays around the corner. You can buy it for other people as well, not just for yourselves to read. I want to thank Val for opening, and I want to thank Steve. Thank you for asking me to do this. It's been such an immense honor, and I'm so glad to know you and your story. Steve, do you have any final words before we turn it over to Jason to close us out for the night?
No, I'm putting it in the chat, but my thanks to you, to Valerie, to UGA, and all my friends and old friends, new friends, and new fans who joined us tonight. You've done my heart great. Just thank you for being here.
Val, do you have any thoughts?
No, it was a great conversation. Thank you both for this. It was fantastic.
All right, Jason, we'll send it over to you, Jason.
Hi, I'm Jason Bennett. I'm the publicity and social media manager at the press. And I'd just like to say on behalf of the press to everyone who has joined us, thank you. Thank you to Valerie again for introducing, and Anjali for moderating such a great conversation, and Steve for the book. I feel lucky and honored to kind of be here and be a part of all of this. So bit of housekeeping note, this event, again, one more thanks to Grady College also for co-sponsoring as well, and to the libraries for helping spread the word. This event was a part of the University of Georgia Spotlight on the Arts Festival, which takes place every year during the month of November. And tomorrow night, I should say that there will be another event for the press. The writer Clarence Major, where the press has published several books with, will be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. So I hope you'll visit our website, ugapress.org, to learn more about that, as well as go on there, search for Steve's book, High Yella, and buy yourself a copy. I've placed the promotional code in the chat at the very top. It will also be available through our website with the code 08 High Yella. So at any rate, thanks so much again for everyone joining us, and we'll see you down the road.